The law of averages in valuation. I threw that extra question mark in there with all the exclamation points because averages is really the key component that I want to talk about today. Now, who am I? I'm Sean Hyde. Pause here if you'd like to read that. Otherwise, moving on. From Wikipedia, the law of averages has a great explanation about how and what it is. Now, I'm mostly concerned with, well, a couple of points on this particular thing. Right here, we're talking about the notion of the law of averages can lead to something called the gambler's fallacy. So he talks about saying if you keep flipping a coin and it keeps coming up heads, eventually it's going to land tails. Well, not necessarily. So as most people refer to the law of averages, it actually reflects on their lack of understanding of what statistics really is. So kind of like when someone's head is on fire and their feet are in the freezer, on average, they're comfortable. It doesn't really work that way. So how does this apply to valuation? So market data, mostly. We have various databases that we can look at we can pull transactions that have happened across the country and see what's happened with these businesses. So all of these, except for peer comps, come from business brokers. Peer comps comes from bankers, but it's still a transaction analysis that we look at to see what kind of potential multiple we might be able to apply to a company valuation to come up with the number, the value, right? Let's talk about averages and use some real examples. So I pulled some data from DealStats here, and we've got 43 transactions. The NICS code is for Floral Shop, and I've already cut them down to between $500,000 and $1 million in revenues. So size differential is basically taken care of. So we have 43 transactions total. Of those 43 transactions, a few less reported their EBITDA figures and their discretionary earnings figures. But we have some data for those anyway. So I went ahead and calculated the smallest multiple shown in the database for each of these multiples, the maximum, the largest multiple paid for each of these, and then I did the average and the median, just to compare them all together. C of E stands for coefficient of variation, which is the standard deviation of the data divided by the mean. In this case, it shows how spread the data is. So the market value invested capital to sales multiple has a C of V of 0.43. And the discretionary earnings multiple is 0.46. That's pretty close to that one. But for this analysis, we're going to look at the sales revenue multiple and the EBITDA multiple, because that's got the largest spread of data, and it's going to drive home the point I really want to make the best. The application of some of those multiples. So you can see here, the minimum as a price to revenues would be $30,400, something like that. And the highest at 0.84 of revenues would be around $640,000. So that's quite the range. This floral shop could have a value somewhere between $30,000 and $640,000. That's not real precise, is it? We look at the EBITDA multiple, and the range is narrower, 44 to 205, right? What I see an awful lot of appraisers do in situations like this is they'll grab the average and the median. Maybe they'll average the two of those together to try to get some kind of a midpoint multiple. And they'll say, okay, we have those numbers. And look, there's another multiple down below that kind of supports our range. So the value of the business must be around $250,000, $260,000. And that's what they do. And that's it. There's no real extra thought or real logic that flows into their analysis. So there's a couple of things I want to talk about here. There's some questions that an appraiser needs to keep in mind as they go through this analysis. One will be, is the subject business that they are appraising a median or an average business? And if not, why apply a median or an average multiple to it? The question is, well, how can we figure out if the business is an average or median business? Well, that's what the comparative financial ratio analysis is for, where you look at the industry averages and you see how the business fits in with those. Is the business underperforming, overperforming? Is it riskier or less risky than the industry average? Now, there's always going to be some of those weird adjustments that have to be taken care of for normalization purposes, right? So I get asked all the time, if I'm doing the ratio analysis, do I adjust my numbers first and then do the comparison? Well, think about where the data comes from. If you're looking at BizMiner or RMA or whatever these other sources are, do the people who collected that data, did they do normalization before they compiled the information for our use? Probably not. So to compare apples to apples, I tend to not make that normalization adjustment before I do the comparison. I will get rid of some of the egregious stuff, like if there's real estate on the books or things like that. But overall, we have to do some kind of comparative. Now, here's a good question though. Why would a buyer pay almost $640,000 for a floral shop? Especially one that's not making that much in EBITDA. Remember the example? It was not making much, 45,000, something like that. And the one transaction that we have data for that showed 0.84 times revenues for their for the purchase price, it lists on the data over $500,000 in intangible assets. Why would a buyer pay for that? And it was on the market for over 500 days. Now that's almost 2 years. So keep that in mind for a minute. Let's look at this next one. How about that little one, the smallest potential transaction? Why would a seller accept such a small amount for their business? So this particular one sold for 20 grand, just over $20,000, and it had just under $20,000 in EBITDA. But it was only on the market for 118 days. Some things to think about. Why? Why might that have been the case? And when you run through the whole database, there's other questions that could be thought about. So for example, thinking about the whole database, since I calculated the average market value invested capital, the average price paid for all 43 transactions as being $185,000, does that mean that all businesses that are within the $500,000 to $1 million revenue range, does that mean they all sell for $185,000? Well, obviously not. We have some data that shows differences. And there are reasons for why certain businesses sell for less or more than the average. There's variables. And might some of these variables affect both not only the selling prices of these businesses, but also our appraisals of them, right? Let's think about the definition of fair market value for a minute. This is coming from 5960, and this is something we all are very familiar with. I want to point out the compulsion section, also known as motivation. So for that first one, the 0.84 times revenues multiple, that business probably did not have a highly motivated seller. And maybe they had some buyers show up that said, hey, I really, really like this business. I want this location. I have family near here. I want to buy this one. And there's some negotiation that takes place. And they finally come to a price that both seller and buyer agree with, and they move on. Now, how about compulsion to sell? The smaller one, maybe that's a motivated seller, a highly motivated seller for whatever reason, health problems, a spouse may have lost a job and needs to move. Who knows? We don't have that information. But here's some other variables that we need to consider. At least keep in mind, right? How these might affect the valuation of the business that we're appraising and the selling prices of those same businesses. So sometimes, like we talked about motivation from the buyer and seller, there's extra motivation going on. Business brokers that I talk to, they've never able to sell a business for a seller that does not want to sell. The seller has to have some sort of motivation in order to get the deal done. Otherwise, it won't sell. Sometimes you'll find a business that's in such a great location because there's very little competition around, right? Or if there's a seller who's willing to hang out and say, okay, you buy the business, sure, I'll stick around for as long as you need. And they can transfer the reputation they've generated over time to the new buyers. Maybe they're willing to introduce the new buyer saying, oh, here's a partner I brought on. And he's helping me run the business. We're doing so well. And then eventually the seller backs away and they start asking the customers, where'd the old guy go? And the buyer would say, well, he's on a fishing trip or whatever. Eventually they stop asking for the seller and they're happy with the buyer because he's been well trained. That's how you move goodwill across. Maybe the buyer has extra knowledge about the industry, is willing to pay a little more because they know they can generate higher growth over the next few years. Or maybe the buyer has additional assets, another business, and the one that they're looking at might have some additional synergy with it. Maybe the seller has written down all of their processes and these plan books where they can transfer all their knowledge easily into a buyer's hands. Maybe that makes the business worth more to a specific buyer. Maybe the contracts or leases are favorable, or occasionally there's real estate involved, a non-operating asset that might affect the price paid for the business. So business appraisers, we don't appraise the real estate. We need to appraise the business itself without the real estate. And we do that by incorporating a lease rate. That's another question to deal with that later. So we don't know any of this information, but motivations on the behalf of the buyer or the seller. We don't know if there was a location issue or a bidding war or whatever's going on. We don't know that information. It's not presented in the databases that we are able to access. But just because we don't have that information does not mean that the price was unaffected by something along those lines, right? Valuation is as much art as it is science. It's our responsibility as the appraisers to incorporate our judgment, right? It's up to the appraiser to decide what data means and how it's going to be applied. We look at these transactions and we say, okay, the range is pretty wide, but it's not always going to be the average or the median that best fits the subject business. We cannot allow just a blind decision to say, we've always done it this way. We've always taken the median or we've always taken the average and just apply them to all of our projects. That is not realistic. Businesses are different. Each business is unique, and their factors and their potential variables need to be considered before we come up with our value conclusions. So that's what I wanted to say about averages and things. Again, this is Sean Hyde, and contact me if you have any questions. I do have one question for you. What do you think about the use of an average or a median multiple when you're appraising a business? Leave me an answer down below in the comments if you would. Thank you.